The morning sun cast long shadows across the driveway of 48 Maple Street in Cedar Falls, Iowa, as the Harrison family loaded their red Ford Bronco with camping gear, coolers, and the excited chatter of children anticipating adventure. It was July 15, 1992, and what should have been the beginning of a perfect summer vacation would instead become one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries in the American Midwest. David Harrison, a 38-year-old insurance adjuster with kind eyes and a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow, double-checked the roof rack where their bright orange tent was secured alongside fishing poles and a small aluminum canoe. His wife Elizabeth, 36, emerged from the house carrying a red Coleman cooler, her blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore denim shorts and a yellow t-shirt that read Iowa State Fair 1991. A memento from what would be their last documented family outing in their hometown. Their children bounded around the vehicle with the infectious energy that only summer vacation could inspire. 12-year-old Timothy, the eldest, had inherited his father's serious demeanor, but carried himself with the confidence of a boy on the cusp of adolescence. He clutched a new disposable camera, a Kodak Funsaver with 27 exposures that his parents had given him specifically for the trip. 8-year-old Amy, with her mother's bright smile and father's stubborn streak, carried a stuffed rabbit named Miss Buttons that had been her constant companion since she was 3. The youngest, 5-year-old Michael, could barely contain his excitement as he climbed into his booster seat, already asking if they were there yet before they'd even backed out of the driveway. The family was headed to Whispering Pines Campground, a rustic retreat nestled deep within the Superior National Forest in northern Minnesota. David had discovered the location through a colleague at work who raved about its pristine fishing and complete disconnect from the modern world. No phone lines, no electrical hookups, just nature in its purest form. For a family seeking to escape the growing pressures of suburban life in the early 1990s, it seemed like paradise. Elizabeth had meticulously planned every detail of their week-long excursion. The coolers contained enough food for 7 days, including pre-made sandwiches, canned goods, and Michael's favorite peanut butter crackers. She'd packed a first aid kit, extra batteries for their flashlights, and enough clothing to handle Minnesota's unpredictable summer weather. In her purse, she carried traveler's checks worth $500, their emergency fund, along with a detailed itinerary she'd typed on her electric typewriter and photocopied at the local library. As David adjusted the rearview mirror and Elizabeth consulted their AAA roadmap one final time, neighbors watched from their porches and waved goodbye. Miss Patterson from next door would later tell investigators that Elizabeth had seemed unusually anxious that morning, checking and rechecking their supplies with an intensity that struck her as odd. But at the time it appeared to be nothing more than a mother's natural concern for her family's comfort and safety. The Bronco pulled away from 48 Maple Street at exactly 8:47 a.m., according to the timestamp on a photograph later found in Timothy's camera. The image, presumably taken by Elizabeth, showed David behind the wheel, his left hand raised in a casual wave toward the house they'd called home for 8 years. In the background, barely visible through the rear window, were the silhouettes of their 3 children, Amy holding Miss Buttons aloft as if the rabbit were waving goodbye too. The drive to Whispering Pines Campground should have taken approximately 6 hours, with planned stops for lunch and gas. David had mapped out their route carefully, choosing scenic back roads over major highways to make the journey part of the adventure. They would take Interstate 35 north through Minneapolis, then branch off onto smaller state highways that wound through Minnesota's lake country before finally reaching the remote forest roads that led to their destination. The last confirmed sighting of the Harrison family occurred at 2:15 p.m. at a Sinclair gas station in Hinckley, Minnesota. The elderly attendant, Walter Kowalski, remembered them clearly because Michael had been fascinated by the dinosaur logo and had peppered him with questions about whether real dinosaurs had ever lived in Minnesota. David had filled the tank, purchased a bag of ice and 2 Coca-Colas, and asked for directions to Whispering Pines, though Kowalski had never heard of the campground. Elizabeth had used the payphone near the service bay to make a brief call, to whom investigators would never determine. After leaving the gas station, the Harrison family vanished, as completely as if they had driven off the edge of the earth. When they failed to return home on July 22nd as planned, Elizabeth's sister Janet became concerned. She'd been expecting a call that evening to hear about their adventures, but the phone remained silent. By the following day, with still no word, Janet contacted the Cedar Falls Police Department to report her sister's family missing. The initial investigation was hampered by the remote nature of their destination and the era's limited communication technology. There was no GPS tracking, no cell phone signals to trace, no digital breadcrumbs to follow. Detective Robert Manning, a 20-year veteran of the force, drove to Minneapolis to retrace the family's planned route, but the trail grew cold quickly in the vast wilderness of northern Minnesota. The mystery deepened when investigators contacted Whispering Pines Campground, only to discover that no such place existed. David's colleague, when questioned, insisted he'd given accurate information, but repeated calls to the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and local park services yielded nothing. It was as if the campground David had described, complete with specific landmarks and amenities, was entirely fictional. Search teams combed hundreds of square miles of forest, following every logging road and hiking trail. The Minnesota State Patrol issued alerts to law enforcement agencies across the Midwest. Elizabeth's photograph, her warm smile now haunting in its innocence, appeared on missing person flyers posted from Iowa to the Canadian border. But weeks turned to months, and months to years, with no trace of the red Ford Bronco or its occupants. The case officially went cold in 1994, filed away in a cabinet alongside dozens of other unsolved disappearances. Detective Manning retired in 1998, carrying the weight of the Harrison case with him into civilian life. The family's house on Maple Street was eventually sold, their possessions distributed among relatives who held on to hope that someday, somehow, answers would emerge from the wilderness that had swallowed them whole. For 32 years, the Harrison family's fate remained one of Iowa's most perplexing mysteries. True crime enthusiasts occasionally resurrected their story on early internet forums, spinning theories about everything from serial killers to government conspiracies. But without new evidence, the case remained frozen in time, a painful reminder of how thoroughly people could simply vanish in an age before constant connectivity and digital surveillance. Then, in October 2024, everything changed. A routine geological survey team, working for a mining company in the remote Boundary Waters region of northern Minnesota, made a discovery that would shatter the decades-long silence surrounding the Harrison family's disappearance. Amanda Foster, a geologist with the University of Minnesota, was leading a small team to assess mineral deposits in an area that had been largely untouched by human development since the early 90s. The survey site was accessible only by helicopter due to its extreme remoteness, nearly 40 miles from the nearest maintained road and surrounded by impenetrable swampland and dense forest. It was here, in a small clearing beside a crystal-clear lake that didn't appear on any official maps, that Foster's team made their first disturbing discovery. Partially buried beneath 3 decades of fallen leaves and forest debris, they found the rusted remains of a red Ford Bronco. The vehicle's license plate, though corroded, was still legible. Iowa plates reading HRN 24/7, the exact registration number that had been circulated in missing person reports since. Foster immediately contacted local authorities, who faced the logistical nightmare of accessing the crash site and conducting a proper investigation in such a remote location. It took 4 days to establish a temporary base camp and begin processing what was clearly a major crime scene. The Bronco's condition told a story of violence and terror. The driver's side door hung open, its window completely shattered. Deep gouges scarred the vehicle's exterior, too large and too numerous to be explained by a simple accident. The roof was partially caved in, and investigators found what appeared to be bullet holes peppered across the tailgate and rear window. Inside the vehicle, the scene was even more disturbing. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the interior. children's clothing, camping gear, and food containers that had long since been claimed by insects and decay. Elizabeth's purse was found on the passenger side floor, its contents strewn about, but her traveler's check still tucked inside an inner pocket, ruling out robbery as a motive. But it was Timothy's disposable camera, discovered wedged beneath the front passenger seat, that would provide the most chilling evidence. The Kodak funsaver had somehow survived 3 decades in the Minnesota wilderness, its plastic housing cracked, but its film canister still intact. Forensic photographer Lisa Chen carefully extracted the camera and transported it to the state crime lab, where specialists would attempt the delicate process of developing film that had been exposed to extreme temperature fluctuations and moisture for over 3 decades. The initial examination of the crash site yielded no human remains, a fact that both puzzled and terrified investigators. The amount of blood evidence found throughout the vehicle's interior suggested serious injuries. Yet there were no bodies, no bones, no trace of what had happened to David, Elizabeth, Timothy, Amy, and Michael Harrison after their vehicle had been attacked in this remote wilderness. Dr. Foster's geological survey also revealed something that added another layer of mystery to the case. The clearing where the Bronco was found showed evidence of regular human habitation dating back decades. Fire pits, foundation stones from primitive structures, and refuse that suggested a permanent encampment of some kind. But there were no records of any authorized settlements in this area, no logging operations, no mining claims, nothing that would explain why anyone would be living in such an isolated location. As word of the discovery spread through law enforcement channels, the case was assigned to Detective Maria Santos of the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. Santos, a 15-year veteran specializing in cold cases, had seen her share of disturbing crime scenes, but something about the Harrison case filled her with an inexplicable sense of dread. The first breakthrough came when the film from Timothy's camera was successfully developed. Of the 27 possible exposures, 19 had captured images, though the passage of time and environmental damage had left many of them badly deteriorated. The first several shots showed exactly what investigators expected: a happy family beginning their vacation. David loading the car, Amy posing with Mr. Buttons, Michael grinning gap-toothed at the camera, Elizabeth consulting her map at what appeared to be a rest stop. But as the photo sequence progressed, the mood changed dramatically. The final images were nearly impossible to make out due to damage, but what could be discerned painted a picture of escalating terror. One photo, apparently taken from inside the Bronco, showed David's hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, his face a mask of concentration and fear. Another captured Elizabeth turned around in her seat, her mouth open as if she were shouting something to the children in the back. The second-to-last photo was the most disturbing of all. Though heavily damaged, it clearly showed the view through the Bronco's windshield, a dirt road stretching ahead through dense forest. But something else as well. At the very edge of the frame, barely visible through the distortion and decay, were what appeared to be human figures standing among the trees. The image was too degraded to make out faces or details, but the silhouettes were unmistakably human, and their positioning suggested they were blocking the road ahead. The final photo was completely black, as if the camera had been dropped or hidden, but audio enhancement specialists believed they could detect sounds captured at the moment the shutter clicked. What might have been screaming, though the evidence was too degraded to be conclusive. Detective Santos stared at the photographs spread across her desk as autumn rain pelted the windows of the Minneapolis field office. The images told a story of a family vacation that had transformed into a nightmare, but they raised more questions than they answered. Who were the figures in the forest? How had the Harrison family ended up in a location that didn't exist on any map? And most disturbing of all, where were their bodies? As Santos prepared to brief her superiors on the case's developments, she couldn't shake the feeling that the Harrison family's disappearance was connected to something far more sinister than a random act of violence. The remote location, the evidence of long-term habitation, the calculated nature of the attack. It all pointed to an organized group operating in the Minnesota wilderness for decades, perhaps longer. But even Santos, with her years of experience investigating the worst of human nature, wasn't prepared for what the deeper investigation would reveal. The Harrison family hadn't simply stumbled upon criminals hiding in the forest. They had driven directly into the heart of something far more terrifying, a community that existed outside the boundaries of civilized society and which had been claiming victims for generations. The photographs from Timothy's camera were just the beginning. Hidden in the shadows of the Minnesota wilderness, Detective Santos would soon discover lay secrets that challenged everything she thought she knew about the limits of human cruelty. The Harrison family's fate was inextricably linked to a mystery that stretched back nearly a century, and their story was far from over. As she reached for her phone to call the FBI field office in Minneapolis, Santos noticed something she'd missed before. In the corner of her desk, barely visible among the scattered photographs and evidence reports, was a single fallen leaf that had somehow made its way from the crime scene to her office. It was unlike any Minnesota flora she recognized. Its surface covered in strange, deliberate markings that looked almost like primitive writing. The leaf crumbled to dust at her touch, but not before she noticed that the markings bore an unsettling resemblance to symbols she'd seen carved into the trees surrounding the Bronco's final resting place. Whatever had happened to the Harrison family 32 years ago, Santos realized with growing dread, was still happening in the depths of the Minnesota wilderness. And now, by discovering their secret, she had become the next target. The FBI field office in Minneapolis buzzed with activity as Special Agent Catherine Reeves studied the evidence spread across the conference room table. A 23-year veteran of the Bureau's Behavioral Analysis Unit, Reeves had seen cases that defied explanation, but the Harrison disappearance presented elements that troubled her on a visceral level. The calculated isolation of the crime scene, the evidence of long-term occupation, and most disturbing of all, the complete absence of bodies despite clear signs of violence. Detective Santos sat across from her, nursing her third cup of coffee as dawn light filtered through the office windows. Neither woman had slept since the previous evening, when Santos had briefed the federal team on her findings. The strange leaf that had crumbled in Santos's hands had been dismissed by most investigators as coincidental forest debris. But Reeves couldn't shake the feeling that it represented something far more significant. "Tell me about the symbols again," Reeves said, her pen poised over a legal pad covered in notes and sketches. Santos closed her eyes, trying to recall the markings she'd glimpsed for only a moment before they turned to dust. They weren't random scratches or natural formations. They were deliberate, carved or burned into the surface, almost like... She paused, searching for the right word. Like hieroglyphs, but not from any ancient civilization I have ever seen. They were arranged in patterns, clusters of 3 or 4 symbols grouped together. Agent Reeves made additional notes, then reached for a file folder marked Historical Analysis, Boundary Waters Region. The Bureau had worked through the night to compile background information on the area where the Harrison vehicle was discovered, and what they'd found painted a picture of a region with a dark and largely undocumented history. The Boundary Waters has always been a place where people go to disappear, Reeves explained, opening the folder to reveal a collection of yellowed newspaper clippings and police reports dating back to the early 90s. But what we are seeing here suggests something more organized than isolated hermits or fugitives hiding in the wilderness. The first document was a 1923 report from the Duluth Herald, describing the disappearance of a surveying team that had been mapping mineral deposits in the same general area where the Harrison vehicle was found. All 4 men had vanished without a trace, leaving behind their equipment and supplies at a campsite that showed signs of hasty abandonment. Local Ojibwe guides had refused to participate in the search, claiming the area was cursed by those who forgot the old ways. A 1947 incident report described the discovery of an abandoned logging camp approximately 15 miles from the Harrison crash site. The camp contained enough equipment and supplies to support a workforce of 30 men, but investigators found no records of any authorized logging operation in the area. Most disturbing were the personal belongings left behind: clothing, photographs, letters from home, as if the workers had simply vanished mid-shift. The pattern continued through the decades. A family of homesteaders in 1958, a group of hunters in 1971, 2 park rangers in 1984, all disappearing in the same remote region of the Boundary Waters. In each case, searchers found evidence of the missing person's presence, but no trace of what had happened to them. What ties them all together, Reeves continued, is that none of these disappearances were ever solved, and in several cases, witnesses reported seeing unusual markings carved into trees near the last known locations of the missing people. Detective Santos felt a chill run down her spine as she studied the historical reports. The implications were staggering. If Reeves was correct, something had been operating in the Minnesota wilderness for over a century, systematically claiming victims with an efficiency that suggested both organization and long-term planning. Their investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. James Crawford, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Minnesota who had been analyzing the crime scene evidence. Crawford looked haggard, his usually meticulous appearance disheveled from a sleepless night in the laboratory. "We need to talk," Crawford said without preamble, setting a sealed evidence bag on the conference table. Inside was what appeared to be a fragment of cloth, stained dark with what Santos assumed was blood. "This was found wedged behind the Bronco's spare tire," Crawford explained. "At first glance, it appears to be a piece of Amy Harrison's t-shirt, the fabric and dye match samples taken from her bedroom. But when we subjected it to microscopic analysis, we found something that shouldn't exist." Crawford opened his laptop and displayed a series of high-magnification images on the wall-mounted monitor. The fabric's weave was clearly visible, but embedded within the fibers were what appeared to be organic compounds that defied classification. "These aren't plant materials or animal proteins," Crawford continued. "They are cellular structures unlike anything in known taxonomies. More disturbing is their apparent age. Carbon dating suggests these organic compounds are between 300 and 400 years old, despite being embedded in fabric manufactured in..." The room fell silent as the implications of Crawford's findings sank in. Agent Reeves was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you saying that whatever happened to the Harrison family involved something that's been in those woods for centuries?" Crawford nodded grimly. "That's exactly what I'm saying, and there's more." He switched to another image, this one showing what appeared to be a hair sample under extreme magnification. This was found on the Bronco's exterior, caught on a piece of damaged metal near the driver's side door. DNA analysis confirms it's human, but like the fabric sample, it shows signs of extreme age despite being deposited relatively recently. Santos studied the images with growing unease. The evidence suggested that the Harrison family had encountered something in the Minnesota wilderness that challenged basic assumptions about biology and human history. But even more disturbing was the realization that whatever had claimed them was still out there, still active after centuries of operation. Their discussion was interrupted by the sharp ring of Santos's cell phone. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, the voice on the other end made her blood run cold. "Detective Santos, my name is Eleanor Whitman. I believe we need to talk about what you found in the Boundary Waters." Santos gestured frantically to Agent Reeves to begin recording the call as she engaged the speaker function. "Who is this?" Santos demanded. "How did you get this number?" "I'm someone who's been waiting 32 years for Timothy Harrison's photographs to surface," Whitman replied, her voice carrying the weight of advanced age, but speaking with clear authority. "And I'm probably the only person still alive who can explain what really happened to that family." Agent Reeves leaned forward, her pen ready to take notes. "Mrs. Whitman, this is Special Agent Catherine Reeves with the FBI. We'd like to arrange a meeting to discuss what you know about the Harrison case." A long pause followed before Whitman spoke again, And when she did, her voice carried a tremor of fear that chilled everyone in the room. Agent Reeves, I appreciate your desire to follow proper procedures, but you need to understand something. The people who took the Harrison family don't recognize federal authority. They don't recognize any authority except their own ancient laws. And now that you have found their sanctuary, you have made yourselves targets. Santos felt her heart racing as she asked, "What do you mean by their sanctuary?" "The place where you found the Bronco isn't random," Whitman explained. "It's one of several sites that have been sacred to a group of people who have lived in those woods since before Minnesota was a state. They call themselves the Keepers of the Old Covenant, and they believe civilization is a disease that must be contained." Agent Reeves interrupted. "Mrs. Whitman, are you talking about some kind of survivalist group or religious cult?" "Neither," Whitman replied flatly. "I'm talking about something much older and far more dangerous. The Keepers aren't dropouts from modern society. They are the descendants of people who never joined it in the first place. Their roots in that wilderness go back to the 1600s, when their ancestors fled to the New World to escape persecution for practices that European authorities considered unspeakable." The conference room fell silent except for the soft hum of recording equipment. Santos felt as if she were listening to something from a nightmare rather than a legitimate law enforcement briefing. "The Harrison family wasn't randomly targeted," Whitman continued. "They were led to that location by someone who knew exactly what would happen to them. Someone who had been watching them, studying them, determining whether they met the criteria for selection." "Selection for what?" Santos asked, though she dreaded the answer. "The Keepers believe that certain bloodlines carry genetic markers that make them suitable for integration into their community. They have been conducting these selections for generations, taking entire families and either incorporating them into their group or using them for other purposes." Agent Reeves had stopped taking notes, her face pale as she absorbed the implications of Whitman's words. "Mrs. Whitman, how do you know all this? What's your connection to the case?" Another long pause, then Whitman's voice, now barely audible. "Because 35 years ago my family was selected too. But unlike the Harrisons, we escaped." The weight of this revelation settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Santos found herself gripping the edge of the conference table, her knuckles white with tension. "Mrs. Whitman," she said carefully, "we need to meet in person. Can you come to our office?" "Absolutely not," Whitman replied quickly. "They have people everywhere, in law enforcement, in government agencies, in universities. They have been monitoring official investigations for decades, staying one step ahead of anyone who gets too close to the truth." Agent Reeves leaned closer to the phone. "Then how do you propose we continue this conversation?" "There's a diner in Grand Rapids called Mulligan's. Tonight at 11 p.m. Come alone, and don't tell anyone else where you are going. If they realize you are meeting with me, we will all end up like the Harrison family." The line went dead, leaving Santos and Reeves staring at the phone in stunned silence. The case had taken a turn that neither investigator was prepared for, evolving from a cold case investigation into something that resembled a thriller more than a routine police matter. "We can't just ignore this," Santos said finally. "If Whitman is telling the truth, we are dealing with something that's been operating for centuries. The Harrison family might just be the tip of the iceberg." Agent Reeves nodded slowly, though her expression remained troubled. "But we also can't proceed without backup. If this group is as dangerous as she claims, we'd be walking into a trap." "Maybe," Santos admitted, "but it might be our only chance to find out what really happened to those children." As evening approached, Santos found herself driving through the darkened streets of Grand Rapids, Minnesota, her service weapon secured in its holster, and her radio tuned to the FBI frequency. Agent Reeves followed in a separate vehicle, maintaining distance while staying close enough to provide support if needed. Mulligan's diner sat at the edge of town like a relic from a bygone era, its neon sign casting red and blue shadows across the empty parking lot. Only a handful of vehicles were present, and Santos felt exposed as she walked across the asphalt under the harsh glare of sodium lights. Eleanor Whitman was waiting in a corner booth, her back to the wall and her eyes constantly scanning the restaurant's entrance. She appeared to be in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and clothes that suggested someone who'd spent decades living modestly. But her eyes held an alertness that spoke of constant vigilance, the gaze of someone who'd learned to watch for danger in every shadow. "Detective Santos," Whitman said as she approached. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit down, but keep your back to the wall." "Old habits." Santos slid into the booth opposite Whitman, noting how the older woman's hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. "Mrs. Whitman, I need you to start from the beginning. Tell me about your family's experience with these keepers." Whitman was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant as if she were looking back across decades of carefully buried memories. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of long-suppressed trauma. "It was 1989, she began. My husband Robert and I had taken our 2 children camping in the Superior National Forest. We'd planned a simple weekend trip, nothing elaborate. But on our second day, we met a man at our campsite who said he was a park ranger. He was very friendly, very helpful. He told us about a special area deeper in the forest where we could see wildlife that wasn't usually visible to tourists." Santos felt a chill of recognition. "He led you away from the main campgrounds?" "Exactly. He gave us detailed directions to what he called a hidden gem that only locals knew about. It seemed like exactly the kind of adventure we were looking for." Whitman's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "We should have known something was wrong when we started seeing the markings." "The same symbols that were found at the Harrison site?" Whitman nodded. "Carved into trees, burned into rocks, arranged in patterns that seemed almost like road signs. But instead of pointing toward civilization, they were leading us deeper into the wilderness, farther from any help." Santos leaned forward, her notebook ready. "What happened when you reached the location?" "We found a clearing beside a lake that wasn't on any of our maps, and we weren't alone. There were other families there, other people who'd been given the same directions by the same helpful park ranger. At first, it seemed like a wonderful coincidence. All these families discovering this beautiful hidden location together." Whitman paused to take a sip of coffee, her hands shaking more noticeably now. "It wasn't until the sun started to set that we realized none of us could remember exactly how we'd gotten there. The trail we'd followed seemed to have vanished, and when we looked more carefully at the other families, we noticed they all shared certain physical characteristics. Hair color, bone structure, even mannerisms. It was as if we'd all been selected according to some specific criteria." Santos felt her pulse quickening as Whitman's account continued to align with the evidence they'd found at the Harrison crash site. "How did you escape?" "My husband was a Marine veteran. He'd learned to trust his instincts in combat, and something about the situation triggered his survival training. While the other families were setting up their campsites and socializing, Robert was studying the tree line, looking for potential threats." Whitman's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "That's when he saw them, people moving through the forest in coordinated patterns, surrounding the clearing. They weren't making any effort to hide once they realized Robert had spotted them. It was as if the pretense was over." "What did they look like?" "Like they'd been living in the wilderness for generations. Their clothing was handmade from animal skins and plant fibers. Their hair was long and unkempt. But their eyes," Whitman shuddered, "their eyes held an intelligence that was terrifying. These weren't primitive people or simple survivalists. They were organized, purposeful, and they knew exactly what they were doing." Santos made notes quickly, trying to capture every detail. "How many of them were there?" "Dozens, maybe more. They emerged from the forest like ghosts, moving with a coordination that suggested years of practice. And they were carrying weapons, not guns, but spears and knives and tools that looked handmade but extremely effective." "What happened to the other families?" Whitman's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Robert grabbed our children and ran. We crashed through the underbrush, following what we hoped was the direction we'd come from. Behind us, we could hear screaming. The diner seemed to grow colder as Whitman continued her account. Santos found herself glancing nervously at the windows, half expecting to see figures emerging from the darkness outside. We ran for hours through the forest, with our children on our backs, and the sounds of pursuit always just behind us. Robert had military training, but even he admitted later that our escape was more luck than skill. We should have been caught within the first mile, but you made it out. Eventually, we reached a logging road, just as the sun was coming up, and a truck driver found us. We were hypothermic, dehydrated, and traumatized, but alive. Whitman wiped her eyes with a napkin. The police who responded to our report found the clearing where we'd camped, but there was no trace of the other families, no bodies, no belongings, nothing to suggest they'd ever been there. Santos felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a horrifying picture. The authorities didn't believe your story. How could they? We were talking about an organized group of people living in the wilderness, abducting families for unknown purposes. It sounded like something from a horror movie, not a legitimate police report. Whitman's voice hardened, but I knew what we'd experienced was real, and I spent the next 35 years researching every missing person case in the region, looking for patterns, and you found them. Dozens of cases spanning more than a century. Families disappearing without a trace in the same general area. Always groups that matched specific physical characteristics. Always lured away from main roads and established campsites by helpful strangers who knew exactly where to lead them. Santos closed her notebook, overwhelmed by the scope of what Whitman was describing. Mrs. Whitman, if this group has been operating for as long as you suggest, why hasn't law enforcement been able to stop them? Whitman's expression grew grim. Because they are not just hiding in the wilderness, detective. They have infiltrated the institutions that are supposed to protect us. How do you think they have managed to operate for over a century without being detected? How do you think they knew the Harrison family was coming? Before Santos could respond, Whitman's attention was drawn to something outside the diner window. Her face went pale, and she began gathering her belongings with sudden urgency. We need to leave. Now. Santos turned to look outside and felt her blood freeze. 3 figures stood at the edge of the parking lot, barely visible in the shadows between the streetlights. They weren't moving, but their attention was clearly focused on the diner. Are those keepers? Whitman confirmed, her voice tight with fear. They have found us. As Santos reached for her radio to call for backup, one of the figures stepped into the light. Despite the warm October evening, he was dressed in what appeared to be handmade clothing from animal hides. His hair hung in long braids decorated with bones and feathers, but most disturbing of all were his eyes, pale blue and completely focused on the diner window where Santos and Whitman sat. He raised one hand in what might have been a greeting or a threat, revealing symbols carved into his palm that matched the markings Santos had seen at the crime scene. Then he smiled, displaying teeth that had been filed to sharp points. Detective Santos, Whitman whispered urgently, whatever happens next, you need to remember one thing. The Harrison family wasn't killed. They were taken. And somewhere in that wilderness they are still alive. The figure in the parking lot held Santos's gaze for what felt like an eternity before melting back into the shadows as silently as he had appeared. The other 2 shapes followed suit, leaving only the harsh glare of sodium lights and the growing certainty that they were being hunted. Santos's radio crackled to life before she could reach for it. Agent Reeves's voice carried a note of barely controlled panic. Santos, we have got movement all around the perimeter. At least 6 individuals, possibly more. They are not trying to hide anymore. Eleanor Whitman was already sliding out of the booth, her movements quick and purposeful despite her age. There's a service road behind the diner that leads to an old logging trail. If we can reach my truck, I can get us out of here. Santos followed Whitman toward the rear exit, her hand resting on her service weapon, while her mind raced through tactical options. The rational part of her training demanded she call for backup, establish a perimeter, and handle the situation through proper law enforcement channels. But the growing dread in her chest whispered that conventional approaches would be useless against an enemy that had been evading detection for over a century. The back door of the diner opened onto a narrow alley that reeked of grease and rotting garbage. Whitman's pickup truck sat beneath a flickering streetlight, its faded blue paint and rusted wheel wells marking it as a vehicle built for function rather than appearance. As they approached, Santos noticed modifications that suggested Whitman had been preparing for this moment for decades. Heavy-gauge steel mesh covered the windows. The tires were reinforced run-flats designed to operate even when punctured. Most telling of all were the symbols carved into the truck's doors, the same markings Santos had seen at the crime scene. But these appeared to be protective wards rather than territorial markers. "Get in," Whitman ordered, firing the engine with practiced efficiency. "And whatever you do, don't look directly at them if they show themselves. Eye contact is how they mark you." The truck lurched forward as Santos climbed into the passenger seat, her radio squawking with increasingly frantic updates from Agent Reeves. The FBI surveillance team had lost visual contact with multiple targets, and unknown individuals were approaching their position from several directions. Whitman guided the truck through a series of back roads that seemed to exist in defiance of any official maps, her driving confident despite the complete absence of streetlights or visible landmarks. The forest pressed close on both sides, creating a tunnel of darkness, broken only by the truck's headlights. "Where are we going?" Santos asked, checking her weapons magazine for the third time in 5 minutes. "To find the Harrison family," Whitman replied without taking her eyes off the road. "If they are still alive after 32 years, there's only one place the keepers would have taken them." Santos felt her heart racing as the implications sank in. "You know where they are?" "I have known for 20 years, Whitman admitted, "but I have never had the courage to go there alone. The keepers don't just kidnap families, Detective, they transform them. What we find might not be recognizable as the people who disappeared in..." The truck began climbing a steep grade that seemed to lead directly into the heart of the wilderness. Ancient pine trees loomed overhead like sentinels, their branches creating a canopy so thick that no starlight penetrated to the forest floor. Santos had lost all sense of direction within minutes of leaving the main road, and she began to understand how easily people could vanish completely in this maze of unmarked trails. Whitman brought the truck to a stop at what appeared to be a dead end, where the trail simply terminated in a wall of undergrowth. But as Santos watched, the older woman climbed out and began pulling aside carefully camouflaged branches, revealing a continuation of the path that had been hidden from casual view. "The keepers have been perfecting their concealment techniques for generations," Whitman explained as they resumed their journey. "Every approach to their territory is designed to discourage or misdirect intruders. Most people who stumble onto their domain are turned around and sent back the way they came without ever realizing what happened. But not everyone. No, not everyone." Whitman's knuckles were white against the steering wheel. "The ones they keep serve specific purposes. Some are absorbed into their community if they show the right genetic markers. Others are used for different functions." Santos didn't want to ask what those functions might be, but the question hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. The truck continued its relentless progress through the forest, following a path that seemed to wind deeper into the earth itself. The sensation was claustrophobic, as if they were descending into the bowels of some massive organism rather than simply driving through wilderness. After what felt like hours but could only have been 30 minutes, Whitman brought the truck to a final stop. Ahead, the forest opened into a clearing that defied every expectations Santos had formed about the Minnesota wilderness. Where she had expected primitive conditions and crude shelters, she instead found evidence of a sophisticated community that had been developing for centuries. Permanent structures built from stone and timber dotted the landscape, their architecture suggesting European influences that predated American settlement. Gardens laid out in geometric patterns showed signs of advanced agricultural knowledge. Most disturbing of all were the watchtowers that ringed the clearing, manned by figures whose stillness suggested they had been aware of the truck's approach for some time. "This is it," Whitman whispered, "the heart of their territory. If the Harrison family is still alive, they are here." Santos studied the settlement through the truck's reinforced windshield, her trained eye cataloging defensive positions and potential escape routes. The community was larger than she had expected, with evidence of a population that might number in the hundreds. Smoke rose from chimneys, indicating active habitation, but there was an eerie quality to the silence that suggested everyone was waiting for something to happen. "How do we get in without being killed?" Whitman reached into the glove compartment and withdrew what appeared to be a necklace made from carved bone and metal. The pendant bore symbols that matched those Santos had seen throughout the investigation, but arranged in a pattern that suggested safe passage rather than territorial marking. "This was given to me by the keeper who helped my family escape 35 years ago," Whitman explained. Not all of them agreed with the council's decisions about outside families. Some believe the old ways have become corrupted by isolation and paranoia. Santos watched as Whitman placed the necklace around her neck, the bone pendant settling against her chest like a talisman. "There are factions within their community. The keepers aren't a monolithic group," Whitman replied. "They are human beings with human disagreements, just ones who happen to have chosen a lifestyle that exists outside conventional society. The moderate faction believes in coexistence with the outside world. The extremists see civilization as a disease that must be contained or eliminated." As if summoned by their conversation, figures began emerging from the settlement structures. They moved with the coordinated precision Santos had come to associate with the keepers, but their body language suggested caution rather than immediate hostility. Several carried what appeared to be ceremonial staffs, while others bore torches that cast dancing shadows across the clearing. "They are going to want to speak with us," Whitman said, checking the pendant one final time. "Whatever happens, don't show fear. They respect strength and despise weakness. And remember, we are here to negotiate, not to fight." The lead figure approached the truck with deliberate steps, his appearance confirming everything Santos had learned about the keeper's lifestyle. His clothing was handcrafted from natural materials, decorated with intricate beadwork and bone carvings. His hair hung in complex braids that incorporated feathers, small animal skulls, and metal ornaments that caught the firelight. But his face, weathered by decades of outdoor living, held an intelligence that immediately commanded respect. Whitman rolled down her window as the figure stopped beside the driver's door. When he spoke, his voice carried the educated cadence of someone who had received formal schooling, despite his primitive appearance. "Eleanor Whitman, we wondered when you would return to us." "Thomas," Whitman replied, and Santos detected a note of genuine warmth in her voice. "I have brought someone who needs to see the truth about what happened to the Harrison family." The man called Thomas shifted his attention to Santos, his pale blue eyes studying her with uncomfortable intensity. "Detective Maria Santos of the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. We know who you are, and we know why you are here." Santos felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. "How could you possibly?" "We have been monitoring official investigations into our territory for over a century," Thomas interrupted. "Your department's radio frequencies are not as secure as you believe them to be. We have been tracking your investigation since you discovered the vehicle." The implications were staggering. If the keepers had been monitoring law enforcement communications for decades, it explained how they had managed to stay ahead of every investigation. More disturbing was the realization that Santos's current location was almost certainly known to her superiors, yet no backup had arrived. "Where are they?" Santos demanded. "Where is the Harrison family?" Thomas studied her for a long moment before stepping back from the truck. "Follow me. But understand that what you see here tonight will change your perspective on everything you believe about justice and civilization." They left the truck in the clearing and followed Thomas along a path that wound between the settlement's various structures. Santos couldn't help but notice the sophisticated engineering that had gone into the community's construction. Solar panels, disguised as decorative elements, provided electrical power. A complex irrigation system channeled water from natural springs throughout the settlement. Most impressive of all was the communications equipment she glimpsed through open doorways. Modern radio transmitters and computers that confirmed the keeper's ability to monitor outside activities. "How many people live here?" Santos asked as they walked. "Currently about 250, Thomas replied, "though our numbers fluctuate depending on circumstances. Some choose to leave and return to conventional society. Others arrive seeking refuge from the failures of modern civilization, and some are brought here against their will." Thomas stopped walking and turned to face Santos directly. "Detective, I want you to understand something crucial before we continue. The Harrison family was not kidnapped in the sense that your law enforcement training would define the term. They were rescued." Santos felt her anger flaring. Rescued from what? A family vacation? Rescued from a society that was destroying them? Thomas replied calmly. David Harrison was drowning in debt from medical bills related to his wife's cancer treatment. Elizabeth Harrison was dying, with perhaps 6 months to live according to her doctors. Their children were facing the prospect of poverty and orphanhood. The words hit Santos like physical blows. Nothing in the missing persons file had mentioned Elizabeth's illness or the family's financial difficulties. How could you possibly know that? Because David Harrison wasn't selected randomly, Thomas explained as they resumed walking. He was recruited. Someone who worked with him at the insurance company had been observing his situation for months, evaluating whether his family would be suitable candidates for integration into our community. Santos felt the last pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with horrible clarity. Someone on the inside, someone who had access to medical records and financial information. The keepers have had representatives in conventional society for generations, Thomas confirmed. We are not isolated primitives, detective. We are a parallel civilization that has learned to exist alongside yours, while remaining hidden from those who would destroy us. They stopped before a large wooden building that appeared to serve as the settlement's community center. Warm light spilled through its windows, and Santos could hear the sound of voices from within. Not the primitive chanting she might have expected, but what sounded like a normal family dinner conversation. "The Harrison family is inside," Thomas said, his hand resting on the door handle. "But I need you to tell her that they chose to stay. They were given multiple opportunities to return to their former life, and they consistently refused." Santos felt her world tilting on its axis. "They are alive? All of them?" "All of them, though you may find them changed." Thomas opened the door, and Santos stepped into a scene that defied every expectation she had formed during the investigation. The interior of the building was warm and inviting, furnished with handcrafted wooden tables and chairs that spoke of skilled craftsmanship. Children's artwork decorated the walls, and the smell of fresh bread filled the air. At the far end of the room, a family sat around one of the larger tables, sharing what appeared to be a simple but hearty meal. Santos recognized them immediately despite the 32 years that had passed and the dramatic changes in their appearance. David Harrison looked up as they entered, his face weathered by decades of outdoor living, but his eyes bright with contentment. His hair had gone completely gray and hung in a single braid down his back. His clothing was handmade but well-fitted, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone who had found his place in the world. Elizabeth Harrison sat beside him, very much alive despite the terminal diagnosis that Thomas had mentioned. Her blonde hair had gone silver, and her face bore the lines of someone who had lived through hardship and emerged stronger. But most striking was the obvious health and vitality she displayed. Whatever treatment she had received here had clearly been successful. Timothy, now a man of 44, had inherited his parents' quiet strength. He wore the same style of clothing as the other keepers, and Santos noticed the ceremonial markings on his arms that indicated full integration into the community. Beside him sat a woman who appeared to be his wife and two children who looked to be in their early teens. Amy, now 40 years old, had become a strikingly beautiful woman whose bearing suggested leadership responsibilities within the community. She wore robes that indicated high status, and her eyes held the wisdom of someone who had been raised in two worlds and chosen between them. Michael, the youngest, had grown into a tall, lean man whose easy smile suggested he had never regretted the path his life had taken. He was engaged in animated conversation with several younger community members, clearly serving as some kind of mentor or teacher. The reunion Santos had expected, tears, dramatic emotions, pleas for rescue, never materialized. Instead, David Harrison simply looked up from his meal and nodded politely. "Detective Santos, I presume. Thomas told us you might be coming." Santos found herself speechless, struggling to reconcile the happy family before her with the tragic victim she had spent weeks investigating. "Mr. Harrison, your family has been listed as missing for 32 years. There are people who have been mourning you all this time." David exchanged glances with his wife before responding. "Detective, we understand that our departure from conventional society caused pain for those we left behind. But we need you to understand that we weren't kidnapped. We were offered a choice, and we made it willingly." Elizabeth leaned forward, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had faced death and chosen life. "When we arrived here in 1992, I had perhaps 6 months to live. The cancer had spread throughout my body, and conventional medicine had exhausted its options. The keepers offered me treatments that your medical establishment would have called primitive, but they saved my life." Santos looked around the room, taking in the obvious health and happiness of the family she had been searching for. "But your vehicle, the blood evidence, the bullet holes, we're staged," Timothy said, speaking for the first time. "The keepers needed the outside world to believe we were dead. They couldn't risk search teams finding this place." Amy nodded in agreement. The blood was from animals. The damage to the vehicle was carefully crafted to suggest violence without actually harming anyone. Even my stuffed rabbit was left behind to make the scene more convincing. Santos felt a mixture of relief and profound disorientation. The family was alive and apparently thriving, but the deception that had facilitated their disappearance had consumed countless hours of investigation and caused immeasurable grief for their extended family and friends. "What about the other families?" Santos asked. "The ones who disappeared over the decades?" "Some chose to join us," David replied. "Others decided to return to conventional society with their memories, adjusted to protect our location. A few, unfortunately, couldn't adapt to either option." The euphemistic language chilled Santos to the bone. What happens to the ones who can't adapt? Thomas, who had been standing quietly near the door, finally spoke. "Detective, every society has methods for dealing with those who threaten its existence. We are no different." Santos realized she was standing in the heart of a civilization that operated by rules completely alien to everything she had been trained to understand about law and justice. The Harrison family was alive and well, but their rescue had been built on deception, kidnapping, and quite possibly murder. "I need to report this to my superiors," Santos said finally. "People have a right to know that this family survived." Elizabeth Harrison stood up from the table, her movement graceful despite her years. "Detective Santos, what exactly would you report?" "That you found a family living peacefully in the wilderness by their own choice. That they refused to return to a society that offered them nothing but debt, disease, and despair. That they were kidnapped as children," Santos replied firmly. "Timothy was 12 years old. Amy was 8. Michael was 5. They couldn't have consented to this. They were offered something their parents' world couldn't provide," Thomas said. "Health for their mother, financial security for their father, education and purpose for themselves. Most importantly, They were given the choice to leave at any time. Santos felt the moral foundation of her worldview cracking under the weight of what she was seeing. The Harrison family was genuinely handy. They had built productive lives in a community that valued them. They had raised children who would never know the pressures and failures of modern society. But they had also been taken from relatives who mourned them for over 3 decades. Their disappearance had spawned countless hours of investigation and caused immeasurable grief, and their story was built on the systematic deception of law enforcement and the probable murder of those who couldn't be successfully integrated into the Keeper's society. "What happens now?" Santos asked finally. David Harrison exchanged glances with his family before responding. "Detective, you have seen our community. You know we are not the primitive cult that law enforcement imagined. We are productive, educated people who have chosen an alternative way of life. You have also seen our capabilities," Thomas added. "We have been monitoring your investigation from the beginning. We know about Agent Reeves, about Dr. Crawford, about every piece of evidence you have uncovered. We could have prevented you from reaching this place, but we chose to let you come." Santos felt the full weight of her situation settling over her like a heavy blanket. She was completely isolated in a community that existed outside conventional law, surrounded by people who had demonstrated both the ability and willingness to make entire families disappear without a trace. "You are going to let me leave," she said, though it came out more as a question than a statement. "Of course," Elizabeth replied with a warm smile. "But we are going to ask you to make the same choice we made 32 years ago. You can return to your former life and report what you have seen here. But if you do, you will spend the rest of your career investigating a community that will simply relocate and continue its existence elsewhere." Santos asked, though she was beginning to understand the alternative. "Or you can stay," Timothy said. "You can help us build something better than the civilization you are trying to protect. You can be part of a community where people matter more than procedures, where justice is about healing rather than punishment." Santos looked around the room at the faces watching her with patient interest. These people had found something that conventional society had failed to provide: genuine community, purposeful work, and freedom from the psychological pressures that drove so many to desperation. But their paradise was built on secrets, deception, and the systematic erasure of those who threatened their existence. "I need time to think," Santos said finally. "Of course," Thomas replied. "Eleanor will show you to guest quarters where you can rest and consider your options. But remember, detective, some choices can't be unmade. Once you leave this place, you can never return." As Eleanor Whitman led her toward a small cabin at the edge of the settlement, Santos realized that her investigation of the Harrison family's disappearance had led her to the most difficult decision of her life. She had found the missing family alive and well, but she had also discovered a hidden world that challenged everything she believed about justice, civilization, and the price of true freedom. Behind her, the Harrison family returned to their dinner, their conversation resuming as if her presence had been nothing more than a minor interruption in their peaceful evening. Ahead lay a night of contemplation that would determine not only the fate of her investigation, but the course of the rest of her life. In the distance, barely audible over the sound of wind through the pine trees, Santos could hear the faint crackle of radio transmissions. Agent Reeves and the FBI team were still out there, still searching for her, still believing that law enforcement could solve every mystery and right every wrong. But as Santos settled into the cabin that would be her sanctuary for the night, she began to wonder if some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved, and if some wrongs were actually rights that conventional society simply couldn't understand. The Harrison family was safe. They were happy. They were exactly where they chose to be. And tomorrow, Detective Maria Santos would have to decide whether justice meant bringing them home or leaving them in the paradise they had found in the shadows of the Minnesota wilderness. The camera that had started it all, Timothy's disposable Kodak with its haunting images of a family's final moments of innocence, now seemed less like evidence of a crime and more like a record of transformation. The terror captured in those photographs had given way to something that conventional society had no words for: a family that had chosen to disappear, and in disappearing had found themselves. As Santos closed her eyes and tried to process the impossible choice before her, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real mystery wasn't what had happened to the Harrison family 32 years ago. The real mystery was whether she had the courage to follow them into a world where missing meant found, and lost meant saved.